There was a place beneath the roots of the world, a place no road could reach, a place no bird crossed. Even the wind seemed to lose its way before arriving there. Above it stood an ancient tree. Its branches disappeared into a darkness filled with stars. Its roots passed through stone, through cold earth, through places no living traveler had ever seen. And beside one of those roots, there was a well. The water did not ripple. It did not reflect the branches above. It did not reflect the stars. It seemed to hold its own darkness. A man stood beside it. His cloak was wet from a long journey. Silver had gathered in his beard. A worn patch of dark leather covered one of his eyes. The other watched the water without blinking. He had crossed mountains to reach this place. He had crossed rivers. He had walked through forests where the paths disappeared beneath his feet. And when he had first stood here long ago, the well had taken something from him, something he could never recover. Now he had returned, not because the well had called him, not because anyone had asked him to come. He had returned because somewhere inside him one question was still awake. The branches moved far above. The earth rested in silence. Then a voice rose from the darkness beyond the water. "You came back." The man did not turn. For a moment he said nothing. Then he answered, "I never truly left." The well waited. It had waited for him before. It could wait again. But his search had not begun here. Here, he had only discovered how much the search could cost. To understand why Odin returned to this silent place, we must go back. Back to a time when both of his eyes still looked clearly upon the world. Back to a time when the world seemed larger than any one mind could hold. Back to a time when every distant mountain promised an answer. And Odin still believed there might be an end to knowing. Back to the beginning. Long before Odin was called wise, he was known for listening. In the great hall where the gods gathered, others filled the evening with voices. They spoke of walls being raised, of storms crossing the mountains, of roads washed away by rain, of distant valleys where no one from the hall had ever walked. Plans were made beside the fire, promises were given. Disagreements rose, sharpened, and slowly softened again. Bowls passed from hand to hand. Wood cracked in the flames, and Odin listened. He listened when others spoke to him. He listened when they spoke to one another. He listened even when their stories had ended. The hall stood high above a broad valley. Its roof was held by dark wooden beams carved with leaves, waves, serpents, and stars. Firelight moved across those carvings. For a moment, a carved branch seemed to bend. A wooden serpent seemed to breathe. Then the flames shifted, and they became still again. Outside, winter had covered the valley in white. Frost gathered along the roof. The moon rested above the distant trees. Beyond those trees stood mountains. Beyond the mountains lay places no one in the hall could describe. That night, 2 travelers had arrived from the eastern road. Snow still clung to their cloaks. Their boots left dark marks across the floor as the ice began to melt. One traveler spoke of a mountain without a visible summit. The other spoke of a forest so old that the people living beside it no longer remembered its name. Those around the fire asked about the cold. They asked about the road. They asked whether the travelers had seen wolves. Odin asked only one question. What lay beyond the forest? The traveler looked toward him. We did not go that far. Why not? The path disappeared. The hall grew a little quieter. Odin leaned forward. A path does not need to remain visible in order to be followed. The traveler glanced at his companion. Neither answered. Soon the conversation moved elsewhere. Someone described a frozen river breaking beneath a wagon. Someone else called for more wood. A cup was filled, a story began. But Odin no longer heard it. He was thinking about the forest, not the forest the travelers had entered, the forest beyond it, the place where the path had vanished, the silence that had persuaded two experienced travelers to turn back. Much later, the hall emptied. The fire sank low. Red light glowed between black pieces of wood. Smoke moved slowly toward the opening in the roof. Odin remained at the table. A cup sat before him untouched. At last, he rose and walked to the doors. The iron latch was cold beneath his hand. When he opened them, winter entered the hall. The air smelled of snow and pine. The moon had crossed half the sky. Below the hill, the dark forest stretched toward the horizon. Beyond it stood the mountains, and beyond those mountains, the unknown. Odin stood in the doorway. The cold reached through his clothing. Behind him, the final ember broke apart and settled into ash. Still, he did not return to the fire. The world did not seem empty to him. It seemed unfinished. There were places he had not seen, words he had not heard, questions no one had thought to ask. And somewhere beyond the edge of everything he knew, another answer was waiting. In the days that followed, Odin began asking older questions. Not the questions needed to build a roof. Not the questions needed to judge the weather, find game, or mend a broken wheel. He asked about the beginnings of things. Why did some rivers never freeze? Why did certain dreams return night after night? Why could a person remember one sound from childhood, yet lose an entire year? Why did strangers sometimes recognize a place they had never visited? Most people had answers. That was not the problem. The problem was that the answers did not agree. One elder said dreams were made from thoughts carried into sleep. Another said dreams arrived from somewhere beyond the mind. One traveler claimed the stars moved because the heavens turned. Another insisted the stars remained still, and the earth itself moved beneath them. Odin listened to every answer. Then he found the weakness inside it. Every certainty seemed to contain a crack. Every explanation opened another question, and each new question pulled him farther from the hall. He walked through forests before sunrise, when mist rested close to the earth. He climbed ridges where the wind had stripped the stone bare. He watched water divide around a rock, then join itself again below. He studied tracks in snow. He watched wolves move together without speaking. He watched ravens rise from a field before any visible danger appeared. The world seemed filled with knowledge, but none of it offered itself freely. One morning, while traveling north, Odin reached a small settlement beside a river. The roofs were low. Smoke rose through narrow openings. Fishing nets hung stiff with frost. Silverfish lay in a row upon a wooden board. Near one of the houses, an old woman sat repairing a cloak. Odin greeted her. "Do travelers pass through here?" "Not often in winter," she said. "Do any come from beyond the northern ridge?" Her hand stopped. A dark thread rested between her fingers. "Sometimes." "What lies beyond it?" "Another valley." "And beyond that?" The woman looked at him. "You ask like someone who believes the world will eventually run out of places." Odin said nothing. The woman returned to the torn cloak. After a while, she spoke again. "There is a man beyond the ridge who remembers more than other men should." Odin stepped closer. "Where?" "Beyond the ridge, beyond the valley, beyond a lake shaped like a broken ring. What is his name? Mimir. The name was unfamiliar. What does he remember? The woman drew the thread through the cloth. Some say he remembers the first sound made by running water. She pulled the thread tight. Some say he remembers words spoken before there were ears to hear them. And what do you say? I say people add greatness to whatever remains far away. Odin looked toward the ridge. Clouds were gathering above it. Have you met him? No. Then how do you know he exists? The old woman's mouth softened into the smallest smile. I do not. Odin liked that answer. Not because it gave him certainty, because it did not pretend to. He watched her hands return to their work. If you believe the stories, he asked, would you go to him? When I was young, perhaps. And now? Now I know that knowledge rarely arrives alone. The needle passed through the cloth. It brings responsibility. Another stitch. It brings grief. Another. It brings doubt. She looked at him, and sometimes regret. Odin turned toward the mountain. What if it also brings truth? The old woman lowered her eyes to the cloak. Then you should be especially careful. By midday, Odin had left the settlement behind. The warning went with him, but it did not slow him. Some warnings close a road. Others only make the road more difficult to ignore. The path climbed steadily. At first it passed through woodland. Snow rested on the branches. Whenever the wind moved through the trees, soft pieces fell around him. Later, the forest thinned. The ground became stone. Frost filled the cracks. Low clouds pressed against the mountain and hid its highest ridges. Odin carried little: a cloak, a knife, food for several days, a water skin. He had not prepared for a long journey because he did not know how far the journey would be. That uncertainty did not frighten him. It drew him onward. By evening, the settlement had vanished behind the folds of the land. The wind grew stronger. Odin found shelter beneath a shelf of stone. He gathered the dry branches he had carried from the forest and built a small fire. At first the flame struggled, then it caught. Warm light spread across the rock. He ate slowly, and he listened to the mountain. High places are never truly silent. Wind enters narrow passages and becomes a distant voice. Ice settles. Stone shifts beneath its own weight. Snow moves across the ground in long whispers. Odin watched the fire until his eyes became heavy. He remembered the old woman. Knowledge rarely arrives alone. He wondered what she had once learned. He wondered what it had taken from her. Then another question appeared. Was wisdom only the memory of pain? And if the answer existed beyond the mountain, would he recognize it when he heard it? By morning, snow had covered the remains of the fire. Odin climbed. For 2 days, he followed the ridge. Sometimes the path vanished beneath drifts. Sometimes it narrowed until only a thin line of earth remained between the mountain and a fall into mist. Still, he climbed. On the 3rd day, the clouds opened. Below him lay a wide valley. A dark river moved through its center. Beyond the river, half hidden by trees, a lake curved through the land like a ring broken in one place. Odin stood on the ridge, and for one strange moment, he felt that he had seen the valley before. Not in life, perhaps in a dream, perhaps in a memory that did not belong to him. The feeling passed. The lake remained. So Odin began to descend. The air softened as he entered the valley. Pine gave way to birch. Snow became silver patches beneath the trees. Water fell from the branches. Moss appeared between the stones. Near the river, Odin found footprints. They were larger than his own, deep, recent. He followed them upstream. Then the footprints ended at the water. No boat rested on the bank. No bridge crossed the current. On the opposite side, no tracks continued. The river was too deep to wade, too swift to enter. Odin searched until sunset. At last, he found a fallen tree stretching from one bank to the other. Its bark shone with ice. Below it, the river moved black and fast between the rocks. Odin stepped onto the trunk, one foot, then the other. Halfway across, the wood shifted. His boots slid. For one brief moment, the world tilted. The river opened beneath him. His hand closed around a broken branch. Cold spray touched his face. He held still. One breath, then another. Slowly, he moved forward. When he reached the opposite bank, he did not look back. The footprints never returned, but deeper among the trees, another sign appeared. A single mark had been carved into the bark of a birch. Not a word, not a picture. A line crossed by smaller lines. Simple, sharp, unfamiliar. Odin touched the cut with his fingertips. It was old, yet the tree had never grown over it. He remained beside the mark until darkness gathered beneath the branches. Then he continued toward the lake. The lake was larger than it had seemed from the ridge. Its dark water curved through the valley and vanished behind the forest. No waves moved across it. No insects touched it. No birds rested along the shore. The stillness did not feel empty. It felt watchful. Odin approached slowly. Near the water stood a narrow shelter built from stone and timber. Moss covered the roof. The door hung open. No smoke rose from it. Inside there was a table, a stool, a clay lamp, a bed covered with old furs. Dust rested on everything. No one had lived there for a long time, yet the wall beside the bed was covered with marks, dozens of them. Some were straight and sharp, some divided like branches, some crossed like pieces of broken bone. Odin recognized the mark from the birch. Here it stood beside others, a pattern, perhaps a language. He studied the shapes as the light faded. At first they appeared simple. Then the longer he looked, the less simple they became. A line could be a branch, a road, a spear, a boundary. A crossing could mean meeting, conflict, exchange, choice. The meaning felt close, not inside the marks, but behind them, like a voice speaking through a closed door. Odin remained in the shelter that night. Sleep came slowly. Near dawn, he dreamed of roots growing through stone. They reached downward through darkness. They passed hidden springs, buried halls, old bones. Along each root, the carved symbols moved like small pieces of light. One of them stopped before him, the mark from the birch. Odin reached toward it. Before his fingers touched it, he woke. The room was cold. Morning light entered through the open door. Someone stood beside the lake. The figure wore a gray cloak and held a wooden staff. Long, white hair moved in the wind. The water remained still. Odin stepped outside. The stranger did not turn. "You slept in my shelter," he said. "I did not know it belonged to anyone. Few things belong to no one." Odin walked closer. "Are you Mimir?" The stranger looked at him. His face carried great age, but not weakness. His eyes were dark, clear, patient. "You crossed a mountain to ask that?" "I crossed it to ask other things." "Of course you did." The old man looked back toward the lake. He did not ask Odin's name. He did not invite him closer. The silence lengthened. At last, Odin said, "I was told you remember what others have forgotten. I remember some things. Do you remember the meaning of the marks inside the shelter?" "Yes." What do they say? That depends on who is reading them. Odin's patience tightened. Then teach me how to read them. Mimir rested both hands upon his staff. You believe reading is the difficult part. What is more difficult? Understanding why you wish to read, to know what they mean, and when you know, then I will understand more than I do now. And when you understand more, Odin answered without hesitation, I will continue. Mimir studied him. The wind moved through his white hair. The lake remained still. Then the old keeper turned toward the northern shore. Walk with me. They followed the lake through the morning. Mimir moved slowly, yet he never seemed tired. He knew where the ground was firm beneath the wet grass. He knew where roots crossed the path. He stepped over stones without looking down. Odin asked questions as they walked. Mimir answered only some of them. What are the marks? Memory given shape. Who made them first? Someone who needed not to forget. What do they contain? What words always contain? Mimir continued walking. Less than we hope. A few more steps. More than we expect. Odin looked at him. Do you always answer this way? When the question arrives before the listener is ready for the answer. After that, Odin was silent. The shore narrowed. Bare branches leaned over the water. They touched the surface without disturbing it. Near midday, Mimir left the lake and entered a forest of ancient ash trees. Their trunks were pale and immense. Their roots rose from the earth like long walls, creating passages between them. The light changed. The sky remained bright above, but little of that brightness reached the ground. The air smelled of wet bark, cold stone, deep water. At the center of the forest stood a tree larger than all the others. Its roots descended into a hollow in the earth. Stone steps had been cut beside them. Mimir began to climb down. Odin followed. With each step, the air grew colder. The forest disappeared above. A dim blue light rose from below. The stairs ended in a cavern. At its center lay a well. It was smaller than Odin had imagined, a circle of dark water enclosed by stone. No symbols covered it, no fire burned beside it. Nothing announced its power. Yet Odin felt the depth beneath it. This water had not fallen recently from the sky. It had not gathered from melting snow. It seemed older than rain. Mimir stood on the opposite side. This is what you came to find. Odin approached. The surface reflected his face, both eyes. The mountain had left dust on his skin. The road had dampened his hair. But he still appeared as he had before leaving the hall. He expected triumph. Instead, he felt the same restless pull he had felt beside the fire, only stronger. What does the water contain? He asked. Nothing that can be contained. What will it give me? A deeper sight. I already see. You see what stands before you. What else is there? What came before? Mimir's voice lowered. What may follow? A pause. What is hidden within? Another. What has been forgotten beneath? Odin looked into the water again. May I drink? You may. A small wooden cup rested beside the stone. Odin reached for it. Before his hand touched the wood, Mimir spoke, but not freely. Odin stopped. What is the price? That is not mine to decide. Whose then? The well's? The cavern became very still. Odin watched his reflection. What does it require? Mimir's answer came quietly. A part of the sight you already possess. Odin understood. Not all at once. First as a feeling, then as a thought, then as something undeniable. My eye. Yes. Odin turned away from the well. He walked several steps through the cavern. His footsteps returned to him in soft echoes. The price was not a symbol. It was not a puzzle. It was not a clever test with a hidden answer. If he agreed, the loss would remain. Every morning, every road, every face. The world would never again appear exactly as it did now. Odin returned to the water. What will I know? Mimir shook his head. That is the question asked by someone who still believes knowledge can be measured before it is gained. You ask me to surrender something without telling me what I will receive. I ask nothing. You brought me here. You came before you knew my name. The words settled between them. Mimir looked into the well. You crossed the mountain because a path disappeared beyond a forest. He looked back at Odin. You crossed the river because footprints ended at the water. He nodded toward the world above. You entered an empty shelter because marks on a wall refused to explain themselves. Then Mimir spoke the truth Odin had not yet spoken to himself. You did not come because I called you. A pause. You came because the unknown has never allowed you peace. Mimir left him alone. The keeper climbed the stone steps and disappeared into the forest above. Odin remained beside the well. The blue light did not change. The water did not move. Time seemed unable to pass there in the usual way. Odin sat upon the stone. At first he considered leaving. There would be no shame in it. He had crossed farther than most would travel for a rumor. He had found Mimir. He had seen the well. He knew the old stories were true. Perhaps that was enough. The thought gave him no comfort. He imagined returning to the hall. The fire, the voices, the travelers. Someone would speak of a place beyond the mountains. And beneath every word, Odin would remember this cavern. He would remember the water. He would wonder what remained inside it. He would wonder whether he had turned away from the one answer capable of changing every question that followed. Odin closed his eyes. In darkness, the choice became simpler. There was only the sound of water moving somewhere far beneath the stone. He opened them again. His reflection waited. Both eyes. One part of him belonged to the world as it appeared. The other belonged to whatever waited beneath appearances. Then Odin understood. The well was not asking him to choose between sight and blindness. It was asking him which kind of sight he valued more. He rose. He removed the knife from his belt. He placed it on the stone. The sound was small, almost ordinary. He washed his hands in the cold water beside the well. Then he stood for a long time, breathing, waiting. There was fear. He did not deny it. Fear moved through him like winter entering a house through a narrow opening. But beneath the fear was the same hunger that had drawn him from the hall. The same hunger that had carried him over the mountain. The same hunger that had never allowed one answer to remain enough. Odin lifted the knife. The cavern held its silence. We do not need to remain with the pain. Some prices are understood without being described. It is enough to know that when Odin finally knelt beside the well, only one eye remained to look upon the water. Blood darkened the cloth against his face. His breathing was uneven. The stone felt cold beneath his hand. For a while he could do nothing but remain there. Then he reached for the cup. The wood trembled in his fingers. He lowered it into the well. The water made no sound. When he lifted the cup, it seemed empty, yet he could feel its weight. Mimir had returned to the foot of the stairs. He watched. He did not speak. Odin raised the cup. The water was colder than ice. It carried no taste he knew. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the cavern disappeared. Odin saw the lake before it became still. He saw rain falling on mountains that had long since changed their shape. He saw rivers crossing valleys where no trees yet grew. He saw roots reaching through darkness, through stone, through buried halls, through the remains of forgotten fires. He saw a child carve the first mark into soft wood because a promise had been broken and needed to be remembered. He saw the same mark cut into stone generations later by someone who no longer knew its first meaning, yet understood enough to preserve it. He saw memory changing as it passed from one voice to another. Truth did not vanish, it bent. It gathered new shapes. Some details faded, others grew larger. Stories became vessels carrying fragments through time. Odin saw that wisdom was not one light. It was a vast night filled with distant fires. Each answer illuminated only what stood nearest to it. Beyond that small circle of brightness, the darkness remained. He felt the lives of strangers, a hunter choosing not to follow tracks into a storm, a ruler refusing a warning because it came from someone without power, a mother remembering the exact weight of a sleeping child long after that child had grown, a man winning the thing he had desired, and discovering that victory had not changed him as deeply as he expected, a woman losing everything she feared to lose, and discovering that she remained. The visions did not arrive in order. They moved through Odin like water through broken ground. Choices, consequences, beginnings hidden inside endings. Endings hidden inside beginnings. He saw how fear could create the danger it wished to prevent. How love could become possession. How caution could preserve a life, or quietly make that life smaller. How the desire to protect could close a hand around something that needed freedom. He saw the world joined by causes too small to notice at the time. A delayed journey, a word not spoken, a door left open, a seed falling on one patch of earth instead of another. Nothing stood alone. Every action entered the lives of others. Every silence became part of a story. The water showed him beauty, but never without change. It showed him joy, but never without the knowledge that joy could pass. It showed him loss, but never without the strange endurance that sometimes followed. Odin had expected knowledge to make the world clearer. Instead, the world became immeasurably more complex. At last, he saw himself. Not as he had been before the well, not as he was now. He saw a traveler standing at the edge of one horizon after another. Each time the traveler arrived, the distance opened again. Each answer became a door. Behind every door waited another road. The vision faded. The cavern returned. The cup fell from Odin's hand and struck the stone. He bent forward, drawing breath as though he had risen from deep water. Mimir waited. For a long time, Odin could not speak. At last he asked how much of that was true. All of it. And how much did I understand? Very little. Odin looked up. The old keeper's face remained calm. You drank once, Mimir said. Somewhere far below, water shifted in the darkness. Odin sat back. Pain moved behind the empty place where his eye had been. Yet beneath the pain, beneath the exhaustion, another question had already begun to form. Mimir saw it. Do not ask me yet. Why? Because you have not finished hearing the first answer. Odin remained beside the well until he could stand without the cavern turning around him. Mimir gave him clean cloth. He gave him a dark covering for the wound. Neither spoke much. Some experiences become smaller when they are placed into words too quickly. By the time they climbed from beneath the roots, evening had entered the forest. Rain touched the leaves. The lake was no longer perfectly still. Small circles widened across its surface. Odin stopped beside the shore. The world looked different, not transformed, reduced. With one eye, distance had changed. The space between near and far seemed flatter. Steps required more care. Branches entered his path sooner than expected. He reached toward a tree and misjudged the distance. His hand closed on empty air, then found the bark. The loss was real. No vision could erase it. Mimir stood several paces away. "Do you regret it?" Odin considered the question. "Yes." Mimir waited. "And no." The keeper nodded. That is often the shape of an honest answer. They returned to the shelter. Rain deepened through the night. Odin sat beside the small lamp and studied the marks on the wall. The marks had not changed, but he had. Now he recognized pieces of their meaning. Not enough to read them fully. Enough to understand how much he had once failed to see. A single mark could hold a sound, an object, a force, an idea. It could preserve. It could conceal. It could guide someone toward truth, or give them a name to place over truth and mistake the name for the thing itself. "The marks are not the knowledge," Odin said. "No. They are paths toward it. Sometimes," Odin turned, "and sometimes paths away from it." "How?" Mimir sat near the wall. "A word can reveal." The lamp flame moved. "A word can also replace the thing it describes." He looked toward the carved marks. People begin to believe the name is the same as the truth. Odin remembered the visions, the stories changing as they moved from voice to voice. "Then how can anything be known?" Mimir answered with one quiet word, "Carefully." The answer was so simple that Odin almost dismissed it. Almost. Rain continued against the roof. For the rest of the night, Mimir taught him several of the marks. Not all, never all. For each symbol, he gave more than one meaning. For each meaning, he gave a warning. And this time, Odin listened without rushing toward the next question. At dawn, he prepared to leave. Mist covered the lake. It moved between the trees like pale smoke. "Will I find you here again?" Odin asked, "if you return?" "That was not my question. It is the only answer I have." Odin drew his cloak around him. The mountain waited beyond the river. Before turning away, he asked one final question. "Why do you guard the well?" Mimir looked across the mist. "Because someone must remember that wisdom has a price." Odin touched the covering over his missing eye. "And if no one guarded it, more would drink. Would that be so terrible?" Mimir looked at him. "Yes." Odin waited for more. No explanation came. So he left the lake, with one answer behind him and another question walking beside him. The road south took longer. Odin had to learn the world again through one eye. At the fallen tree above the river, he crossed on his hands and knees. On the mountain, distances deceived him. Stones seemed closer than they were. Narrow ledges demanded patience. At first he hated the slowness. Then he began to understand it. Before the well, Odin had moved through the world, as though arriving mattered more than traveling. Now every step required attention. The mountain was no longer only an obstacle between one answer and another. It became present. He noticed layers in the stone, the direction of the wind, the small shelter formed where snow gathered beneath a ridge. He heard water moving under ice. He saw more shades of gray, green, and white than he had ever taken time to name. Loss had narrowed his sight. It had also changed his attention. When he reached the northern settlement, the old woman was again seated outside. This time she was weaving a basket from thin branches. She looked up. Her gaze moved first to the dark covering over his eye, then to the mountain behind him. You found him. Yes. And the knowledge? I found some of that as well. She returned to the basket. Was it worth the price? Odin sat upon a low stone. I do not know. The old woman nodded. Then perhaps you learned something. He watched her bend each branch into place. Why did you warn me? Because warnings are among the few gifts people refuse before understanding their value. Did you think I would turn back? No. Then why speak? The woman considered this, so that when you paid the price, you would know someone had told you it existed. Children crossed the frozen ground carrying pieces of wood. Smoke rose into the clear morning. The settlement looked ordinary, but Odin now felt the invisible stories surrounding it. Promises, losses, choices. Memories preserved, memories changed. He stood. Thank you. The old woman did not answer. But when Odin began to walk away, she called after him. Traveler. He turned. When you find the final answer, she said, come back and tell me. Odin looked toward the road. I will. The woman lowered her eyes to the basket. Neither of them believed him. When Odin returned to the great hall, winter had begun to loosen its hold on the valley. Water ran from the roof. Dark earth appeared beneath the snow. Inside, the hall remained much as he remembered. The carvings watched from the beams. Firelight moved across the walls. Voices rose around the long table. For a moment, no one noticed Odin standing beside the doors. Then the conversation stopped. Faces turned. Someone crossed the room and asked what had happened. Another asked where he had gone. A third asked who had attacked him. Odin answered none of them immediately. He removed his cloak. He sat near the same place he had occupied before leaving. A cup was placed before him. This time he drank. That evening he told them only part of the journey, the mountain, the river, the lake. He did not describe everything he had seen in the water. He did not yet have the words. And now he understood that words would never be enough. Someone asked whether Mimir had given him wisdom. Odin looked into the fire. No. The person frowned. But you paid a terrible price. I did. For what? A piece of burning wood collapsed. Sparks rose through the smoke. Odin watched them disappear. For the beginning of it. The hall became quiet. Outside, the wind moved along the roof. Much later, when everyone had gone, Odin walked again to the doors. The night was softer now. Water fell from the eaves. The moon shone across the wet ground. Odin looked toward the distant mountains. Most people believe that every answer makes the world a little smaller. Odin had discovered the opposite. Every answer opened another door. Behind that door, another question waited. Knowledge had not ended his search. It had shown him how little of the road he had traveled. Somewhere beyond the mountains were marks he could not yet read. Stories he had not yet heard. Questions waiting for someone to recognize them. Behind him the hall was warm. Before him the world remained unknown. For a while, Odin stood between them. Between the fire and the road. Between the answer he had gained and the questions still waiting beyond it. Then he stepped into the night. Far to the north, beneath the roots of the ancient trees, the dark water of Mimir's well became still once more. Waiting. Not because Odin's search was finished, because his search had only just begun.